For more than 500 years, an island appeared on the maps of the known world. It was drawn with precision. Named with certainty. Placed west of Ireland, in the cold Atlantic waters where fog meets horizon and the line between sea and sky dissolves into grey. Cartographers included it in their works. Navigators searched for it. Scholars debated its location. And yet, no expedition ever returned with proof of landing. No merchant ever traded there. No colony was ever founded on its shores. The island was called Hy-Brasil. And for centuries, the world treated it as real. This is not a story of deception or error. It is a story of belief, of how something could exist on parchment and in imagination with such force that absence became merely a question of timing. How cartography, before it became a science of measurement, was an art of compilation. How the edge of the world was drawn not only from what sailors had seen, but from what they had been told, what they had read, and what they believed must be there. Hy-Brasil was not alone. The medieval and early modern maps were populated with islands that would later vanish: Antilia, St. Brendan's Isle, the island of the seven cities. But Hy-Brasil endured longer than most. It appeared on Venetian portolan charts in the 14th century. It was still being drawn in the 18th. And even after it disappeared from official maps, it remained in memory, woven into Irish folklore, Atlantic legend, and the deep uncertainty that accompanies any attempt to chart the unknown. The first known appearance of Hy-Brasil comes from the Catalan Atlas of 1375, a masterwork of medieval cartography created for the King of France. In that atlas, the Atlantic is already populated with islands, some real, some mythical, some impossible to distinguish. Among them, west of Ireland, appears a circular island divided by a river. It is labeled Brasil. Over the following decades, the island appears again and again. In the Pizzigani chart of 1367. In the map of Andrea Bianco in 1436. In the works of German, Italian, and Portuguese cartographers who drew the Atlantic with increasing detail and decreasing certainty. The name shifts: Brazil, Berzel, Hy-Brasil, Hy-Brasil, but the placement remains consistent, somewhere in the Western Ocean, south or west of Ireland, at the threshold of the world. The shape varies. Sometimes it is circular, divided neatly by a channel or river. Sometimes it is crescent-shaped, like a broken ring. Sometimes it appears as two islands, close together, suggesting a landmass split by water or time. But it is always there. And it is always drawn with the same cartographic confidence as England, Iceland, or the Azores. The name itself became a source of interpretation. Some believed it derived from the Irish Hy-Brasil, referring to a legendary high king of the world in Gaelic tradition. Others saw a connection to Breas, meaning beauty or worth, an island of beauty, waiting beyond the horizon. Still others linked it to Brazil, the red dyewood that had been traded from the East for centuries, long before the South American landmass received the same name. In medieval commerce, Brazil wood was prized for its deep crimson dye, used in textiles, manuscripts, and royal garments. An island named Brazil could have suggested a place of value, of trade, of something worth seeking. But the most persistent association was not commercial. It was mythological. In Irish and Scottish Gaelic tradition, there existed a belief in Tir na Nog, the land of the young, a paradisiacal realm beyond the western sea where sickness and death did not exist, where time moved differently, and where the fortunate might dwell in eternal youth. Similar tales appeared across Celtic cultures: islands of mist, islands that appeared and disappeared, islands visible only once every 7 years. Hy-Brasil became, in many tellings, one such island. Not merely a geographic feature, but a threshold, a place that existed between the material and the otherworldly, between map and myth. By the 15th century, the existence of Hy-Brasil was not only accepted, it was actively pursued. In 1480, John Cabot the Younger, sailing from Bristol, set out with the explicit goal of finding the island. His father, the more famous explorer who would later reach Newfoundland, may have sought it as well. Bristol merchants had long been interested in the western Atlantic. They financed multiple expeditions. They believed, as many did, that lands existed beyond the known coasts of Europe, lands that might offer new trade routes, new resources, new opportunities. Hy-Brasil was one of those possibilities. The expeditions returned without success. But absence of evidence was not, in that era, evidence of absence. The Atlantic was vast. Fog was common. Currents were unpredictable. Islands could be missed. A failure to find Hy-Brasil did not mean it wasn't there. It meant only that it had not yet been reached. And so the island remained on the maps. In 1497, the Spanish diplomat Pedro de Ayala reported that men from Bristol had been searching for Hy-Brasil for 7 years. In 1498, another expedition was recorded. The island's location was discussed, debated, adjusted. Some placed it near the latitude of southern Ireland. Others moved it further west, closer to the shipping lanes that crossed the Atlantic after Columbus. The searches continued sporadically into the 16th century. And still, the island appeared. Medieval and early modern cartography operated under different principles than the maps of later centuries. Precision, as understood today, was not always the goal. Maps were compiled from multiple sources: travelers' accounts, ancient texts, other maps, oral tradition, and educated conjecture. A cartographer in Venice or Majorca might never have sailed the Atlantic, yet would compile information from Portuguese sailors, Irish monks, Arab geographers, and classical sources like Ptolemy. This was not carelessness. It was methodology. A map was a synthesis of knowledge, not a photograph. When cartographers drew Hy-Brasil, they were recording belief. They were including an island that others had included, that expeditions had sought, that tradition affirmed. To omit it would have been to ignore what was collectively understood. And so it endured, not because anyone could prove it existed, but because no one could definitively prove it did not. The island became a fixture. It appeared alongside the Azores, which were real. It appeared near Greenland and Iceland, which were real. It appeared in proximity to coasts that sailors knew and recognized. Its placement gave it legitimacy. Its repetition gave it authority. While cartographers drew the island, those who lived along the western coasts of Ireland kept their own versions of the story alive. In Gaelic tradition, Hy-Brasil was not always visible. It was said to be shrouded in mist, appearing only once every 7 years, and even then, only for a single day. Those who saw it described a land of green hills and shining towers, of abundance and peace. But to reach it was nearly impossible. The mist would lift, the island would appear, and before a ship could draw near, the fog would descend again and the land would vanish. Some stories told of individuals who had landed there. They described inhabitants who lived without aging, who welcomed visitors but warned them not to stay too long, for time moved differently on the island. Those who remained risked never being able to return, or returning to find that decades had passed in the outside world. In one tale, a fisherman from the Aran Islands cast his line and hooked something solid. He pulled, and realized he had snagged not a fish, but the island itself. He held fast, and Hy-Brasil began to rise from the sea. But before it could fully emerge, the line snapped. And the island sank back beneath the waves, lost once more. These were not stories meant to be taken as literal navigation instructions. They were expressions of longing, of mystery, of the human need to believe that beyond the known world, something else existed, something better, something uncorrupted, something still untouched. And yet, the stories and the maps did not exist in separate realms. They reinforced one another. The maps gave the stories geography. The stories gave the maps meaning. As European powers expanded their reach across the Atlantic, the maps began to change. The coastlines of the Americas were charted. The Caribbean was explored. The outlines of continents replaced the speculative islands of earlier centuries. And yet, Hy-Brasil remained. Even as Antillia disappeared from the maps, even as St. Brendan's Isle faded, Hy-Brasil persisted. It appeared in the work of Abraham Ortelius in the late 16th century. It was included in maps by Gerardus Mercator. It was drawn by Dutch, French, and English cartographers well into the 1600s. Why? Perhaps because Ireland's western coast was still remote, still difficult to survey with precision. Perhaps because the waters there were treacherous, and ships avoided them when possible. Perhaps because the belief, once established, became difficult to dislodge without definitive proof. Or perhaps because the island served a function beyond geography. It marked the edge of certainty. It represented what remained unknown. In an age when the world was being mapped with increasing accuracy, Hy-Brasil was one of the last places where imagination and cartography still overlapped. In 1674, a ship's captain named John Nisbet reported that he had found Hy-Brasil. Nisbet, sailing from Scotland, claimed that he and his crew had been blown off course by a storm. When the weather cleared, they saw land, a large island, green and inhabited. They went ashore. They met the inhabitants, who were hospitable and generous. They were given silver and gold. They stayed for a day, then departed. Nisbet's account was recorded and circulated. Other sailors from the same voyage corroborated the story. A second expedition, led by Captain Alexander Johnson, was said to have reached the island shortly after, confirming what Nisbet had reported. For a brief moment, Hy-Brasil was no longer a legend. It was a discovery. But no further expeditions could locate it. The coordinates provided did not match any known landmass. The descriptions were vague, inconsistent. The silver and gold, if they existed, were never produced. And slowly, the certainty dissolved. By the early 18th century, British and Irish surveyors had charted the western coast of Ireland with greater precision. No island existed where Hy-Brasil had been drawn. The waters were empty. The maps were corrected. And the island, after 5 centuries, began to disappear. In the 19th century, oceanographic surveys revealed something unexpected. West of Ireland, approximately where Hy-Brasil had been placed on many maps, there existed a large underwater plateau, a shallow region rising sharply from the deep Atlantic floor. It was named the Porcupine Bank, after the research vessel that first surveyed it in detail. The Porcupine Bank is real. It is vast, roughly the size of Ireland itself. At its shallowest points, it rises to within 200 meters of the surface. During the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower, parts of it may have been above water. Could Hy-Brasil have been a folk memory of land that once existed? Could sailors have encountered shallows, tide-exposed rocks, or shifting sandbanks that seemed like an island? Could the stories have been rooted in something real, distorted over centuries into myth? It is possible. But it is not provable. What is certain is that the Porcupine Bank is now deep underwater. No part of it breaks the surface. No island exists there today, nor has any existed in recorded history. And yet, the alignment is curious. The maps, for all their inaccuracy, had placed something in approximately the right location. Not an island, but the memory of where an island might once have been. Hy-Brasil was not simply a cartographic error. It was a belief sustained across centuries by institutions, navigators, scholars, and storytellers. It appeared in works of high learning and in oral tradition. It was pursued by merchants and remembered by fishermen. It existed in Latin texts and Gaelic songs. It mattered because it represented the limits of knowledge. In an age when the world was still being defined, when the horizon was still contested, an island like Hy-Brasil held a particular kind of power. It was not yet proven, but it was not yet disproven. It remained in the realm of the possible. And possibility, in the context of exploration, was a kind of currency. For the Irish and Scottish communities along the western coast, Hy-Brasil was something else. It was a symbol of what lay beyond suffering, beyond poverty, beyond the hardships of daily life. It was a place where the rules of the world did not apply, where time could be escaped, where the eternal was accessible. These were not naive beliefs. They were expressions of hope in a world that offered little guarantee of comfort or justice. The island did not need to be found. It needed to be imaginable. By the middle of the 18th century, Hy-Brasil had been removed from most authoritative maps. The blank spaces of the Atlantic had been filled with real islands, real coasts, real coordinates. The age of speculative cartography had ended. But memory does not follow the same rules as maps. In Irish folklore, Hy-Brasil never disappeared. It remained in songs, in stories, in place names. Even today, the name survives in local tradition along the western coast. It is remembered not as a geographical mistake, but as something deeper, a symbol of longing, of mystery, of the space between what is known and what is hoped. The island became a metaphor. It was the place you could not reach. The dream you could not quite grasp. The world that existed just beyond sight, always one voyage away. Hy-Brasil was never found because it was never lost. It existed in the space between record and myth, between map and story, between the charted and the imagined. For centuries, it was treated as real, not because of evidence, but because of belief. And that belief was powerful enough to shape the way the world was drawn, the way expeditions were planned, the way entire cultures understood the ocean that bordered their lives. When the island disappeared from the maps, it did not disappear from memory. It remained as a reminder of how knowledge is constructed, how certainty is built, and how the unknown is never truly empty. It is filled with what we bring to it, our hopes, our fears, our need to believe that beyond the edge of the world, something else exists. Hy-Brasil was an island that cartographers drew for centuries. But what it represented was older than cartography. It was the belief that the world is larger than what we can see. That the horizon is not the end. That somewhere, just out of reach, lies a place we have not yet touched. And in that sense, it was never a mistake. It was a kind of truth. The maps have been corrected. The coordinates have been confirmed. The Western Atlantic has been surveyed, measured, and understood. No island exists where Hy-Brasil was drawn. But the story remains. It remains in the archives of medieval cartography. In the records of Bristol merchants. In the folklore of Ireland. In the name of an underwater plateau that may, or may not, have once broken the surface of the sea. It remains because it was never only about geography. It was about what people needed the world to contain. And that need does not disappear when the maps are redrawn. Hy-Brasil is gone. But it is not forgotten.